The Cursed Prince. Prologue. The town of Castle Hill lay beneath a perpetual shroud of mist, nestled in the English countryside. At its heart stood an old castle, a brooding silhouette against the skyline. Legends spoke of a cursed prince, whose malevolent spirit haunted the castle's halls, a remnant of his dark past. Chapter 1. The Call. I sat in my office, a small, dimly lit room cluttered with files and old case notes. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows on the walls. The ceiling fan above me turned slowly as if struggling against the weight of time. I was sifting through a pile of bills, wondering how I'd make ends meet this month. Being a detective in the digital age wasn't what it used to be. The thrill of the chase had been replaced by endless scrolling and data analysis, and I was beginning to feel like a relic from a bygone era. Just as I was contemplating my dwindling bank account, the phone rang. The sound was jarring, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Jack Sullivan," I answered, trying to mask the weariness in my voice. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Lady Victoria Blackwood," said a voice on the other end, elegant yet tinged with anxiety. "I require your assistance. There are strange occurrences at my castle. You must come at once." "Strange occurrences?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. My skepticism was hard to hide. "Yes. Doors slamming shut, lights flickering, and at night, dreadful wails and moans," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "The townsfolk are growing fearful, and I cannot ignore it any longer." I paused, considering her words. Perhaps this wasn't a matter of life and death, but it could be a welcome distraction from my financial woes. Besides, an old castle sounded far more interesting than my current stack of unpaid bills. "All right, Lady Blackwood, I'll come, but let's be clear, I don't deal with ghosts. I find real-world explanations for these things." "Please, Mr. Sullivan, just come. You'll see that what's happening is very real," she insisted. With a sigh, I put aside the bills and reached for my hat. Maybe this would be more than just another mundane case. Perhaps within the walls of that castle, I'd find a reminder of why I became a detective in the first place. "I'll pack and head out today," I replied, jotting down the address. "Expect me in a few hours." As I hung up the phone, a sense of anticipation stirred within me. This could be the break I needed, a chance to step back into the shadows and solve a mystery worthy of my skills. Arson, Chapter 2. Arrival at Castle Hill. The drive to Castle Hill was long but scenic, winding through the fog-laden countryside. The castle loomed in the distance, a dark, imposing structure perched on the hill, surrounded by dense woods. It looked like something out of a Gothic novel, and I couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement as I approached. Lady Victoria was waiting for me at the gates, dressed in an elegant gown that seemed more suited to a bygone era. Her long, dark hair was pulled back, and her piercing blue eyes regarded me with a mix of hope and desperation. "Mr. Sullivan, thank you for coming," she said, extending her hand. "Lady Blackwood." I nodded, taking her hand briefly. "Tell me more about these strange occurrences." "Of course. Please follow me," she said, leading me through the grand entrance of the castle. The interior was just as imposing as the exterior, with high ceilings, stone walls, and antique furnishings. The air was cool and carried a faint scent of old wood and candle wax. As we walked, Lady Victoria recounted the events that had been plaguing the castle. "It started a few weeks ago. Doors began to slam shut on their own. Lights flickered as if touched by unseen hands, and at night the most dreadful sounds, wails and moans that chill the blood." "And you've experienced these things yourself?" I asked, noting the genuine fear in her eyes. "Yes, Mr. Sullivan, every one of them," she replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The staff are terrified, and I fear they may leave. Even the townsfolk speak of the curse of the prince." We reached a large sitting room where a fire crackled in the hearth. Lady Victoria gestured for me to sit. "This is where it often begins," she said. "Please make yourself comfortable." I settled into a high-backed chair, taking in the room's opulence. "I'll need to speak with everyone who's witnessed these events," I said. "And I'd like to start tonight to see if I can observe anything myself." Lady Victoria nodded. "Of course, Mr. Sullivan. I've already informed the staff of your arrival. They will cooperate fully." With that, she excused herself, leaving me to ponder the eerie tales she had shared. The room was quiet, save for the crackling fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I dismissed it as paranoia, but I resolved to keep my senses sharp. This case was already proving to be more intriguing than I had anticipated. Chapter 3. The First Night. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the castle grounds. I decided to start my investigation in the East Wing, where most of the disturbances had been reported. Armed with a flashlight and a notebook, I made my way through the dimly lit corridors. The castle was a labyrinth of hallways and rooms, each one filled with antique furniture and portraits of stern-looking ancestors. As I turned a corner, I heard the faint sound of a door creaking open. I quickened my pace, reaching the source of the noise. A large wooden door that led to one of the tower rooms. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The room was empty, but a chill ran down my spine as I scanned the area. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I stood still, listening. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the old castle settling. Just as I was about to leave, a low moan echoed through the room. I spun around, flashlight beam darting across the walls, but there was no one there. The sound came again, louder this time, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Get a grip, Jack," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease. But the sound persisted, growing more intense with each passing second. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice steady despite the growing tension. There was no reply, only the continued moaning that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. I decided to document the experience, jotting down notes in my book. As I wrote, the moaning gradually subsided, leaving me in silence once more. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. This was only the beginning, and I had a feeling that the nights to come would be even more disturbing. Chapter 4. The Locals. The next morning, I decided to visit the local town to gather more information. My first stop was the parish, where I met Reverend Thomas. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. His short, graying hair and conservative black suit gave him an air of quiet authority. "Mr. Sullivan, welcome," he greeted me with a warm handshake. "I've heard about the troubles at the castle. It's a most unsettling situation." "Reverend Thomas, can you tell me more about what you've witnessed?" I asked, taking a seat in his modest office. "Certainly. I've seen signs, Mr. Sullivan. Signs that suggest a supernatural presence. Just the other day, a cross in the chapel fell over by itself. And there have been whispers, voices in the night that seem to come from nowhere." I listened intently, noting the sincerity in his voice. "And you believe these are the work of a ghost?" The Reverend nodded. "I do. The spirit of the prince is restless. His sins in life have bound him to this place, and he cannot find peace." I thanked Reverend Thomas for his time and made my way to the local library, where Miss Margaret awaited. She was an eccentric woman in her early 50s, with curly red hair and an enthusiastic expression. Her bright clothing and constant fidgeting made her hard to miss. "Oh, Mr. Sullivan, I've been looking forward to meeting you," she exclaimed, practically bouncing with excitement. "There's so much to tell about the castle. Did you know that in 1835 it was the site of secret rituals and the ghost sightings? Oh, they're absolutely fascinating." I couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. "That's quite a lot of information, Miss Margaret. Can you tell me about any recent events that might be connected to the disturbances?" She leaned in conspiratorially. Well, there have been reports of strange lights and figures moving about the grounds at night, and just last week Old Man Jenkins swore he saw the ghost stealing his slippers. I raised an eyebrow. Stealing his slippers? Yes, he's quite certain of it. Jenkins is always good for a story, she said with a chuckle. But there's something else. I've been researching the prince's history, and I believe there might be more to his curse than we know. I thanked Miss Margaret and decided to pay a visit to Old Man Jenkins himself. He lived in a small cluttered house on the edge of town. As I knocked on the door, I heard a gruff voice call out, "Come in if you must." Jenkins was a wiry old man in his 70s with a permanent scowl etched on his weathered face. He wore old, worn-out clothes and a cap that looked like it had seen better days. "What do you want?" he barked, eyeing me suspiciously. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm investigating the disturbances at the castle," I explained. "I heard you had an encounter with the ghost." "Encounter? Ha! That blasted spirit stole my slippers," he grumbled. "Can't a man have any peace around here?" I couldn't help but grin at his indignation. "I'm sure it must have been quite a shock. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Jenkins launched into a colorful tale, full of exaggeration and humor. Despite his gruff exterior, it was clear he enjoyed the attention. "It was the middle of the night and I heard a noise. Went to check and there it was, a ghostly figure, plain as day, holding my slippers. I chased after it, but it vanished into thin air." I thanked Jenkins for his story, leaving with a sense of amusement and curiosity. The town of Castle Hill was certainly full of interesting characters, each adding a piece to the puzzle. Chapter 5. Rising tension. Back at the castle, the atmosphere was thick with tension. As night fell, I prepared for another round of investigations. Armed with my flashlight and notebook, I made my way through the darkened corridors, my senses on high alert. The castle seemed to come alive at night, with every creak and groan of the old building amplified in the silence. I reached the east wing, where most of the disturbances had been reported. The air was cool, and a faint draft stirred the dust motes in the air. Suddenly a door creaked open behind me. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. I took a deep breath and continued down the hall, my footsteps echoing off the stone walls. As I approached one of the tower rooms, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for a moment, I questioned my skepticism. Could there really be a ghost? I entered the room, scanning it with my flashlight. The moaning sound I'd heard the previous night began again, low and mournful. It seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steady despite the growing tension. There was no reply, only the continued moaning that grew louder and more intense. I documented the experience in my notebook, noting the time and details. As I wrote, the moaning gradually subsided, leaving me in silence once more. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. This was only the beginning, and I had a feeling that the nights to come would be even more disturbing. Chapter 6. The Breakthrough. The next day, I decided to explore the castle grounds. Lady Victoria had mentioned an old tunnel that connected the castle to a neighboring building. I found the entrance hidden behind a bookshelf in the library, just as she had described. The tunnel was dark and musty with walls of rough-hewn stone. I followed it, my flashlight casting a narrow beam of light ahead. After several minutes, I emerged in an old storage room filled with dusty crates and cobwebs. As I examined the room, I noticed signs of recent activity: footprints in the dust, a recently moved crate, and an open trap door leading to a lower level. My heart raced with anticipation as I descended into the darkness. The lower level was a network of narrow passageways, and I soon found myself in a large chamber. There, I discovered a group of townspeople gathered around a makeshift altar, their faces illuminated by candlelight. They looked up in shock as I entered, and for a moment there was silence. Then, one of them stepped forward. It was Reverend Thomas. "Mr. Sullivan, this isn't what it looks like," he stammered. "Oh, really? Because it looks like you're staging the hauntings to scare Lady Blackwood into selling the castle," I replied, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Reverend Thomas sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Yes, that's true. We needed the money to save the town. The castle could be a major tourist attraction, but only if it had a compelling story. And you thought a haunted castle would do the trick," I said, shaking my head. Unbelievable. Chapter 7. Confrontation. Back at the castle, I confronted the townspeople with the evidence I had gathered. Lady Victoria was there as well, her face a mask of shock and betrayal. "How could you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "You used my home, my family's legacy for your own gain." Reverend Thomas looked genuinely remorseful. "We didn't mean to hurt you, Lady Blackwood. We were desperate. The town is struggling, and we thought this was the only way." "Desperation doesn't justify deceit," I said firmly. "You manipulated everyone and you put people in danger." There was a tense silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Finally, Lady Victoria spoke. "I understand your motives, but this was not the way to achieve your goals. We will find another solution, one that doesn't involve lies and deceit." The townspeople nodded, their heads hanging in shame. It was clear that they regretted their actions, and I hoped they would learn from this experience. Epilogue. Lady Victoria decided to organize a festival based on the castle's history, but without the staged hauntings. The event was a success, drawing visitors from near and far. The town of Castle Hill began to thrive, its fortunes turning around in an honest and ethical way. As for me, I packed my things and prepared to leave. Lady Victoria thanked me for my help, and I promised to visit again someday. Driving out of town, I couldn't resist one last look at the castle. As I turned back, my breath caught in my throat. There, hovering above the castle, was a ghostly figure, unmistakably the prince. The apparition looked directly at me, its eyes hollow and sorrowful. It raised a hand in a gesture that seemed both a farewell and a warning, and then slowly faded into the night. My heart pounded as I tried to process what I had just seen. There was no doubt in my mind this was no trick, no staged haunting. The ghost of the prince was real. As I drove away, the image of the spectral prince lingered in my mind, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew. Perhaps some mysteries were never meant to be fully understood.